Hey guys, LevelCap here, and today we're going to take a look at Crysis Remastered, which was one of my most anticipated releases of the year. I was really looking forward to revisiting the original game with improved graphics, better performances, gameplay fixes, all the stuff that remasters generally offer. And boy, was I disappointed. Many people view the remaster as a quick and dirty cash grab. And today, I want to take a deeper look at both the remaster and the original game to figure out if Crytek is pulling on our heartstrings or if they actually preserve the original game for modern players. And before we go any further, I have a quick word from our sponsors. Today's video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. They're an affordable VPN provider with some pretty competitive features. Now, I'm not here to tell you that Surfshark is more secure than a competing VPN. It uses the same AES 256 encryption standard everyone else does, which is the gold standard for security. But unlike most competing VPNs, Surfshark includes an ad blocker, a whitelister, allows torrents, and has independent auditing. It also includes a no borders mode that unblocks websites some countries censor. You get a lot more bang for your buck with Surfshark over its competitors without sacrificing features or security. They have apps for Mac, Windows, Linux, iOS, Android, and even game consoles. So no matter what device you're using, Surfshark can secure it. Unlike the competition, Surfshark doesn't limit how many devices you can connect with at once. This is great for small businesses and families with lots of online devices. You can keep your employees and family safe from malicious ads and insecure websites. For more info and to sign up for Surfshark VPN, check the link in the description. And if you use my code LevelCapGaming at checkout, you'll get 83% off and 3 months for free. Thanks to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Alright, so before I go over some of my disappointments with the Crysis Remaster, I will say that the visuals and performance are definitely better than the original game. Some of the changes are pretty subjective and don't fit the game's tone, like say increased saturation and altered time of day in some areas, but overall the remaster is a better looking, better running version of Crysis. Crytek also did a pretty good job of improving stability. Over the years, it's become harder and harder to play the original game on modern PCs because it'll just crash or refuse to open unless you do a ton of troubleshooting and mess around with community patches and mods. And that's pretty frustrating seeing the original game's age just starting to catch up with it, even regarding basic functionality. The remaster launches properly and I haven't had any significant stability issues. Now obviously just booting up the game isn't something I would consider a feature of a remaster, but if you think about it, the old game is barely playable on modern hardware, so coming out with a version of the game that does actually launch counts for something. And if it sounds like I'm really reaching for compliments here, well, it's because I am. The performance of Crysis Remaster is where things really start to fall apart. The single biggest issue with the original Crysis is performance. Even on modern hardware, it's bottlenecked by the relatively low CPU clocks we can utilize compared to what Crytek expected future PCs to be. They thought CPUs would be running at 7 or 8 gigahertz by now. Obviously, that hasn't happened since we've really gone with the multi-core approach, and the game is now horribly CPU bound. And in a very odd way, the remaster suffers the same problem. Don't get me wrong, it runs better, even with the new visual effects turned on, but it's still limited to 4 cores and it's bottlenecked by, again, clock speeds. And while I certainly appreciate some of the visual improvements, Crytek absolutely should have put performance first. And right behind performance, they should have worked on some of the gameplay mechanic issues. Crysis has a lot of gameplay and mission design issues. On top of that, it tries to be both an open world tactical immersive sim and a blockbuster action set piece experience. That works great in the game's opening levels where you're free to run around, causing mayhem and destruction while tossing chickens at the enemies and blowing up their cover. But it really falls apart in the linear sections like, say, the boat escape. One wrong move and you'll beach the boat, forcing you to take fire from a helicopter while you desperately try to punch the boat back into the water. And some of these weird mechanics only seem to get worse as the game progresses. And where things really fall off the rails, or should I say hop on the rails, is the final level. Not only was the last level of the original Crysis particularly bad, but it's even worse in the remaster. You're trapped on an aircraft carrier, confined to tight corridors and a flight deck with just boxes and debris for cover. The different angles of attack, interesting cover, buildings, and other environmental elements that make the game's starting hours so much fun are completely gone. It's just you, a bunch of aliens, nowhere to run, and really boring gameplay mechanics. The final boss fight was already a slog in the original game, but at least we had quick saves then. The remaster doesn't have quick saves and instead relies on a checkpoint system. Of course, the final boss is a multi-stage fight where you have to destroy parts of it to do damage, but there are just no checkpoints between destroying the individual parts. With quick saves, that's no big deal. Just save the game as soon as you blow off a part and you're good. But without quick saves, well, let's just say I haven't had the interest in trying to slog through this final fight. Obviously, there are other problems with the battle, like the boss having a freeze ray that locks you in place repeatedly, and the lack of adequate cover. Now, on one hand, I totally understand the idea of remasters preserving some of the core aspects of the original experience, or trying to keep it as intact as possible for future generations to sort of see what this pristine game was like in its heyday. The problem with that, though, is that it works best on games that were nearly perfect, and games that did have some flaws can always be looked at and or improved. Take the latest Tony Hawk games, for example. They preserved the core experience, but they also improved it in certain areas, polishing it up for modern gameplay standards. I think it's exactly what a remaster should be. And Crysis has a lot of weak areas. So, what should they have done differently, in my opinion? Well, I would have added a ledge grab from the sequels so that you could climb buildings and waterfalls instead of just floating in place like Skyrim. This would have opened up new attack angles and streamlined traversal across many of the levels. Also, the difficulty options in the original are kind of binary and don't make a lot of sense. If you want enemies to speak their native language, you have to set the game to maximum difficulty. I would have added the optional setting that enables native language and vehicle health regen so that players could enable or disable those options regardless of the overall difficulty setting. Also, an option to enable the original game's time of day settings would have fixed many of the game's strange lighting that we see in some missions. The weapon quick select system from the original game is really an absolute mess in this. Instead of a more traditional circle, it's a scrolling grid, and when you're trying to quickly select a weapon for a certain situation, you end up just playing weapon roulette. Now, the game's latest patch does add hotkeys for weapon selection, and I'll talk more about the patch in just a second, but a real weapon wheel would have been so much better. Another big problem that hasn't been addressed is the game's mouse sensitivity requires tweaking its range in the config files just to be playable. Even on the lowest settings, it was still way too fast for my mouse when I set the normal DPI to 800. This is just basic PC functionality that should have absolutely been fixed. Also, they certainly could have added in a separate slider for your ADS sensitivity since its ratio is very different from most of the modern games I play. This is something that should have absolutely been added in just to update some of the basic controls to be more in line with modern first-person shooter experiences. And finally, I would have overhauled the missions that players didn't even like from the original game. At the bare minimum, I would have added a lot more cover to the final boss fight and added in a checkpoint sequence just to make it playable. And at most, I would have redesigned the boss fight to just be more interesting and dynamic. Now, to make the game more playable and enjoyable, there's a lot of config file tweaks that you can make, like changing NPC spoken language to Korean and adjusting the field of view. In fact, Crysis's console commands are noteworthy for just how dramatically they let you mess around with the game. LevelCapGaming has even managed to get ray tracing working on an AMD Athlon APU thanks to the game's console commands, which is kind of insane. But I think the default out-of-the-box experience shouldn't require a bunch of tweaking to the setting file just to make the game enjoyable. One thing to note is the footage you've been watching has been me playing the game with Digital Foundry's recommended settings. If you've been struggling to achieve even 60 FPS, check out their settings. You'll have to sacrifice some of the enhanced visual settings that the remaster offers, and ray tracing is still very hit or miss depending on your hardware, but the game runs so much better with their settings than anything else I've tried. Alright, so is the Crysis Remaster actually just a cash grab? Well, the latest patch for the game made a bunch of big improvements. Missing features from the original like leaning, quick throwing explosives, classic nanosuit shortcuts, and more were added back in. It fixed some of the big issues with ray tracing and a bunch of other problems. Overall, it was a good patch to the game, and Crytek says that there's more in store to achieve the best PC and console experience possible with more updates. So it seems like they are invested in improving the remaster, and I don't think cash grab is necessarily the right term to describe it. It just seems undercooked and certainly less than what I would have wanted from a proper Crysis remaster. The Crysis franchise will always be legendary, and it demands a certain level of respect for its technical achievements. But aside from some fun gameplay elements, it's always been a bit more of a glorified tech demo. And that's certainly not to say that this remaster is a bad game. Even by today's standards, it feels pretty modern, especially with the improved visuals. But it's by no means a fun and engaging experience from start to finish. All that said, I do have hope for the future of the franchise. If Crytek can hammer out the remaster's problems, I think that they could capitalize on the rewarded hype for the franchise and maybe even make a proper, say, Crysis 4. Seeing what the studio's been capable of with Hunt Showdown, I do think a new Crysis game could be incredible in the right hands. But what do you guys think? Did the Crysis remaster let you down? Did you expect more significant overhauls to the gameplay? Did you never play the original and are just enjoying the remaster? Let me know in the comments down below. That's all I got for you guys today. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more content in the future, and I'll see you guys next time. This is LevelCap signing off.